Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and over the next 2 weeks, we are going to look into the history of knitting and crochet as a sort of companion to last week's episode, where I spoke to Nicole Narek about her book, With Her Own Hands, where she explores women's history in relation to textile crafts. Usually I cite sources at the end of the episode, but I do want to highlight a video that I watched titled History of Knitting 10th Century to Modern Times that was hosted by the Gail Borden Public Library. Librarian and knitting historian Liz Kristan is just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the history of knitting, and this episode would definitely not have been possible without her knowledge. As always, there will be a link in the show notes to the video, and also support your public libraries. I know mine is getting lots of use through my current audiobook addiction. So with that, let's get right into today's episode. Our modern day knitting is preceded by something called nail binding, which had been around for thousands of years earlier than the first known instances of knitting, like all the way back to 6500 BCE in what is today modern day Israel. So it's been around for a long time. The finished products from nail binding look very similar to knitting, which had historians unsure for many years on if something was nail bound or knitted. This wasn't found out until the 1970s when archaeologists who were studying some Viking ruins actually realized that nail binding and knitting were actually two different crafts and not the same thing. This was discovered by Danish archaeologists, so that's why nail binding is known as its Danish name rather than what it would have been called in the area that the craft originated. When it comes to knitting, knitting is one of the oldest forms of needle arts, through class lines and around the world. The origins of knitting are shrouded in a bit of mystery as it is a textile and can degrade over time. But the earliest known instance of knitting would be 2 pairs of stockings from about 1000 to 1500 CE. What we can say for sure is that the origins of knitting can be traced back to around 10th century Islamic Africa. As these items are socks and actually contain quite a bit of technical knowledge to create, it can be assumed that knitting had been around in some capacity before these socks were knitted, but we just can't place exactly when. What we do know is that all knitted objects from this period were made in the round and made with cotton yarn. In the middle of the Middle Ages, knowledge of knitting had spread from the Middle East and up into Europe, where the earliest known surviving piece of European knitting came from the 13th or 14th century. These European knitted items seem to have been crafted for the wealthy, as they were quite ornate, not like something that you would use as an everyday person. But with that, there is still evidence that knitting was a domestic task due to the rather large amount of paintings that depict the Virgin Mary knitting. Now, I had not been subject to these paintings prior to this episode, but there are in fact quite a few paintings showing the Virgin Mary knitting. This medieval era knitting was still performed in the round, but now, in addition to cotton, there is evidence of silk-based yarn being used as well. We also just have more items from this time period preserved. They are still like 600-year-old stockings or socks, but they are definitely newer than, say, 2,000-year-old socks. In her presentation, Liz Kristan points out that though the knowledge of knitting had been transferred from the Middle East to Europe in about the 13th century, it wouldn't be until about the 16th century that the Europeans actually started to knit socks. Liz makes note that in the Islamic areas where knitting originated, the most common items crafted would have been stockings or socks. So somehow in the transfer of knowledge, we passed along how to knit, but either did not learn or did not retain the art of knitting socks, and didn't refigure it out for about 200 years. Before medieval Europeans were knitting socks, they were wearing poorly made socks that were produced by cutting fabric to the size of the wearer's legs and shaping it to match the wearer's leg shape. Now, that does not sound very comfortable. The 16th century did have a couple major inventions when it came to knitting, one of which was the purl stitch, as up until the 16th century, everything had been knit in the knit stitch. The 16th century also saw the first ever published knitting pattern, and I'm going to say that we know of. You never know if there was something printed earlier that just didn't withstand the passing of hundreds or even thousands of years. So the first known published pattern that we know of came from a 1524 Danish book of needlework. Liz goes on to explain how England and mainland Europe viewed the act of knitting differently. In England, knitting was something that anyone could do. I could do it, you could do it, a duchess could do it. But in mainland Europe, one had to belong to a knitting guild of some kind to be legally allowed to knit. How scandalous. Illegal knitting. Knitting was not only a fun pastime for those in England, but it was also a way for people to create some extra income. With that in mind, in the 17th century, they actually had to pass a law that banned knitting during times of harvest due to the tendency for people to spend their time knitting rather than working on harvesting the harvest, which had a relatively small window to bring in. And England did have knitting guilds, just not to the extent that mainland Europe did. Let's spend a bit of time on the knitting guilds. To join a guild, you had to be considered a master knitter, male, and have apprenticed for 3 to 5 years with a master knitter before being even thought of to join the guild. You would also have to provide work that shows your level of craftsmanship. Within the guild, you could have what would be considered unskilled workers underneath you, someone who knew how to knit but was not able to produce complicated works. Women were also forbidden to do complicated work or even to repair items. As knitting spread around the world, various regional styles of knitting started to pop up, which would mean that certain styles, patterns, or color choices would be more popular in certain areas than others. In the 18th and 19th century, certain patterns were named for the area where the pattern was originally seen. An example of this would be like Fair Isle sweaters. This time period is also where the types of stitches used started to get a bit more technical and designs would be more elaborate. So there was a pretty significant increase in the complexity of knitting patterns over time, especially in the patterns that like your everyday person would do, not something that a master knitter would do, but someone who is just knitting at home. As knitting became less of a need or necessity during the industrial era, especially as clothing began to be mass-produced, knitting started to be seen as more of a fun pastime, with more of a focus on more decorative pieces. The industrial era is also when patterns started to become more standardized. As Liz puts it, it was the Wild West for knitting patterns. Prior to this standardization, patterns would not include the knitting needle size, the yarn weight, or even what the gauge would be. It was sort of trial and error before the standard patterns started to come about. As the Industrial Revolution transitioned into the World War I time period, more and more people started to wear their knitted sweaters out and about, as prior to this, knitted sweaters were seen as more of a home item of clothing, more akin to, say, your ratty pair of sweatpants that you wouldn't dare leave the house in. But with this standardization of knitting patterns and more sophistication in the crafting of sweaters, knitted sweaters started to go from something that wouldn't see the light of day to something that was actually cool to wear. When World War I was happening, knitting was not put to the side, but instead of knitting for yourself, it was highly encouraged that you knit something like scarves, socks, hats, or even cotton bandages, which would be shipped to the war front to be used on the battlefield. Socks were the most important thing those who stayed home during the war effort could knit. Primarily, they were used to keep the foot dry, as having any wetness trapped inside the boot could cause serious harm to the soldiers. Also, the standard issue military boots were very, very uncomfortable, and many soldiers would double up on socks to make standing in these boots just bearable enough. So socks were knitted all throughout the US to send to the front lines so the soldiers could protect their feet from injury, because even if the foot was dry, having foot injuries due to lack of support in a shoe would also be pretty terrible. World War I is also where Kitchener stitch was popularized, having been previously known as grafting. We touched on this a bit last week with Nicole, but in short, during World War I, the Minister of War, Lord Kitchener, had put out a request in the British newspapers that knitters make seamless socks to prevent rubbing on soldiers' feet, and this request and his insistence that these socks be seamless led to this stitch being referred to as the Kitchener stitch. After the war and the need for items like socks and bandages went away, sweaters started to become more popular again. Designers like Coco Chanel were even getting into the knitted sweater game. The 1920s also saw the first introductions of artificial materials like rayon being used in knitting for the first time. Previously, only natural fibers like wool or silk had been used in knitting. The following decade, the 1930s, where the main thing happening was the Great Depression, also saw the first patent for circular knitting needles, all made of metal. So while they were something many knitters may use today, these first iterations of the circular knitting needles were not very popular, as the metal needles and metal cord would catch on the yarn, causing the yarn to pill up. During World War II, knitting for the war effort was not nearly as expansive as it was in World War I. What did happen during World War II was an emphasis on using what you have to make new clothing items, like using bits of leftover yarn to make a blouse. With the transition out of wartime, knitting started to be something that was advertised as a fun and exciting activity. The 1960s introduced us to probably my favorite activity in what would be the crochet world, but in the knitting world, knitting while watching TV started to become really popular. There were even pattern books that advertised easy patterns that were not too complicated to follow so that they could be completed while watching TV. We now had more artificial yarns, like acrylic and nylon, come to the scene. And we actually had usable circular needles with a nylon cord rather than a metal cord hit the market. Shortly after this was when knitting started to become a less cool activity and where we really saw knitting become something that was seen as a quote-unquote grandma activity. Jumping ahead just a bit, with the ever-increasing use of the internet in the early 2000s, knitting did start to transition back into something that was a more popular activity and even something that would be considered cool again. And this just increased throughout the last 20 years or so, especially with the advent of social media like Instagram and Facebook. But the social media site Ravelry, which is specific for knitters and crocheters, really helped to spread the new popularity of knitting, especially with the younger crowd. Even up through the pandemic, where people started to pick up on new fiber arts as they were spending more time at home and wanted to do something with their hands. And that's where I'm going to end today's episode. Let me know if you are a knitter or someone who is interested in the history of various fiber crafts. I myself am a crocheter. I can knit, not very well, but I can make a basic scarf or beanie if for some reason I really needed to. I hope you learned something new about knitting today. Sources for today's episode include the YouTube video mentioned at the top of the episode titled History of Knitting, 10th Century to Modern Times, hosted by the Gail Borden Public Library, featuring knitting historian Liz Kristan, and an article titled The History of Hand Knitting from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, please head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a review. If you want to email me any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. I'm pretty active on both. Thank you again for listening, and I hope to have you in the next one where we are going to be looking at the history of crochet.